And hello again, back to this next session now with our next speaker, Alessandro Galloni, who is at Rutgers, and he works on behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity. So back to biological plausible here. Looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thanks, Peterman. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the opportunity to present. So today I'm going to talk about a synaptic plasticity mechanism, which was discovered in the hippocampus called behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity. And I'm talking about our efforts to implement an abstract version of this that can perform credit assignment in artificial neural networks. So kind of one of the interesting question in learning and memory research is how can the brain propagate outcome or error information between neurons to coordinate plasticity towards global network objectives. So this is what we refer to as credit assignment. And in the last few years, there have been several recent approaches to doing this biological plausible credit assignment. I've just listed kind of a few of the more notable ones here. And one of the big innovations sort of in this field has been drawing inspiration from pyramidal neurons in cortex, and specifically looking at their apical dendrites as a form of specialized compartment that's dedicated to processing error information. And as well as combining this with other biological building blocks like somatic or dendritic interneurons. And so by taking inspiration from these biological features, these authors have come up with different rules that do biologically plausible credit assignment, and in some cases approximate quite closely the weight updates that you would get by using gradient descent and backpropagation. And that's generally kind of seen as the goal, to try to, as close as possible, approximate backpropagation for at least for these previous networks. So today I'm going to show you our approach to this problem, which is specifically inspired by some more recent experimental findings on how synaptic plasticity works in the hippocampus. And I'll sort of describe a little bit what's different about this approach. So I want to start from the biology, and I'll start with kind of three key insights that we're going to draw on. So the first one is that in the hippocampus, then you can get neurons that have dendritic plateau potentials. And these dendritic plateau potentials can rapidly produce stimulus selectivity in silent neurons. So here we see a recording from one of these hippocampal pyramidal neurons. Initially, the neuron is silent. The inputs are too weak to drive it to fire anywhere in this environment. Now, once in the second lap of this environment, we see this large depolarization called a dendritic plateau potential or a calcium spike. And kind of in a single trial, in a one-shot way, this has strengthened some of the inputs, which make the cell now become stimulus selective for part of this region, of this arena. Okay, insight number two is that these plateaus can be controlled by both top-down input as well as inhibition from local interneurons. So here we see a recording from a CA1 pyramidal cell in which the top-down input can act as a critical trigger for driving this dendritic calcium spike, this plateau potential. And what we see on the right here is that the plateau potential can be suppressed if we directly drive a local dendrite targeting interneuron. So we can kind of specifically control just the plateau and separately from controlling the activity of the neurons. Okay, and the third point I want to make from the biology is that the induced plasticity is actually bidirectional. So you have different synapses that can either potentiate or depress simultaneously. And this depends on their initial strength and also on the timing relative to the plateau potential. So what we see here is that the same cell as before. It has an existing place field in the center of the arena. And now in lab 4, a new plateau potential arrives at a different location. And this causes two things to happen simultaneously. Now, the first thing is that the inputs that are active close to the new plateau potential, they get potentiated, and that results in a new place field at this location. The second thing is that the previously strong synapses that were driving the cell to fire at the old place field, they get depressed so that the cell becomes silent in that region. And kind of we see a summary of that here on the right, where synapses either potentiate or depress based on timing from this plateau. So if they're close to the plateau, they potentiate. If they're far, they depress. And this is modulated by the initial weight of the synapses. So weak synapses primarily potentiate, whereas synapses that are already very strong have a much stronger bias towards depression. Okay, so that's the biological inspiration. So how can we model the mechanics of this? So one way we can model this is through as an interaction between like a slow eligibility trace that's generated by the presynaptic spikes and an instructive signal that's generated by the dendritic plateau. So when the delay is large, or for example, if the firing rate is very low, now the overlap between these two signals is going to be small, and that will favor depression. So conversely, if the overlap between these two signals is high, or if, for example, if the firing rate of the presynaptic neuron is very high, that would cause a larger eligibility trace, then that would favor depression. So we might imagine a synapse that is of intermediate strength could experience either potentiation or depression, depending on this firing rate. A synapse that's very weak would favor potentiation, whereas a synapse that's very strong would favor depression. Okay, so we've now abstracted these principles into a rule for doing supervised learning in networks with kind of simple two-compartment units. And the implementation that I'm going to show you today is actually in analog rate neurons, but we do think that we could kind of export these same principles and make them work in spiking neural models, and that's something that we're planning on doing in the future. Now, like in biology, this learning rule depends on presynaptic activity, it depends on the dendritic plateau, and it depends on the initial weights. So here, the equation that we've derived has two components. It has a potentiation process and a depression process. And these are modulated by the dendritic plateau, as well as by the previous existing weights. So as the weights increase, then the ratio between the potentiation process and the depression process change, and that will favor depression. Now, kind of as proof of principle that this can work in a multi-layer setting, we've implemented a network with a single hidden layer and units with dendritic compartments. And during learning, the output layer learns by having target activity directly driving plateau potentials in the output dendrites. Now, to propagate this error information, the plateaus increase the activity of the output units, which then drive the hidden dendrites. So this increased feedback drives the hidden dendrites, and the local loss at the level of the hidden units is encoded in this dendritic activity, which results from a balance between the feedback that they're getting from the output layer and inhibition from a local dendritic interneuron, which and if this hidden dendrite activity crosses a certain threshold, then a plateau is generated, and this will induce plasticity in the input to hidden weights. And so this dendritic interneuron kind of helps regulate the number of plateaus in the hidden layer and keep the learning in the hidden layer in check. So I'm going to show you now kind of results on a toy model, but it's a simple one-hot autoencoder task. And although this is a simple task, it does have some interesting properties. So for one, it requires effective multi-layer error propagation because it has a hidden layer. And the way we've implemented it is this autoencoder has a reduced dimension in the hidden layer. And this forces the network to learn kind of a compressed combinatorial representation at the hidden layer. So not just a simple identity function. But it's still small enough that we can kind of easily interpret how the network is learning and what weights it arrives at. So for comparison, I'm going to show you two models trained with exactly the same architecture. One is trained with this BTSP learning rule that I've just described, and another one is trained with backprop. And so because this is a relatively simple task, both networks learn to perform with perfect accuracy relatively quickly. And so this is kind of a good first validation that our learning rule is working as intended. But now to understand how the learning rule is working and how it behaves, we can then look closer at what solutions do these networks converge onto. And so, for example, by looking at the final activity representations in the hidden layer, we can already see that there are some interesting differences in the final solutions, even though at the level of the output layer, they look the same. So let's dig into this a little bit more. And so to get a better sense of how the networks differ during learning, what I'm going to show you is how the learning trajectories for the two networks navigate through the loss landscape. So this is a dimensionality reduced representation of this high dimensional loss landscape. So this is in weight space. And we can see that backprop here, that's using stochastic gradient descent, directly follows the gradient straight down the loss landscape and arrives at some minimum. BTSP, on the other hand, actually initially almost seems to move in the opposite direction to the gradient, but then converges on a local minimum in a different region of the loss landscape. And we can see that these are actually quite different solutions to the same problem. And we can already get a quick sense of that by looking at the distribution of weights that they converge onto, which are quite substantially different, which suggests that the BTSP learning rule is really doing something that's maybe fundamentally a bit different than gradient descent, and specifically occupies kind of a narrow region, perhaps, of the weight space. The weights are not quite as broadly distributed. Now, the last result I'm going to show you today is kind of a slightly modified version of this same task. So in this case, what we do is we first train the network on only a subset of the inputs. And then in the second phase, we train the networks again, but this time we show only held out patterns. So we're sort of doing a simplified continual learning task. Now, as before, both networks are able to perfectly learn the initial set of training patterns and get 100% accuracy. But what's interesting is what happens in the second phase. So as we train the network on these kind of new unseen patterns, then backprop actually experiences a substantial amount of catastrophic forgetting of the old patterns, as well as interference by these new units, which are interfering with the representations learned by the old pattern, and that effectively dramatically reduces the overall accuracy of backprop over the whole set of patterns. And BTSP, on the other hand, seems to be much more robust to this and still manages to encode all of the patterns with relatively high accuracy. And this might be kind of a consequence of perhaps the increased level of sparsity that we get in the activities or in the weight matrices of these final learned solutions. That decreases the interference between the new learned patterns. Okay, so just to summarize what I've told you, today I described a biologically plausible learning rule, which was inspired by experiments in the hippocampus. The weight updates depend on the interaction between existing weights, presynaptic activity, and postsynaptic plateau potentials. And the dendrites encode the local error, which is computed by a local microcircuit that involves dendritic interneurons. And I've shown you a simple implementation that demonstrates learning good representations across hidden layers in this like rate neuron network. And finally, I've shown you that this learning rule seems to converge on different solutions than backprop. And these different solutions that is biased towards might make it more robust to something like catastrophic forgetting during continual learning tasks. So finally, I just want to thank the people who've been involved, especially Aaron and Ajay, who've been really instrumental in all of this. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. So first question is again by Sandra Keming. Neither backprop nor BTSP would consistently find the same local minimum for different initializations. Do they find consistently different solutions across a range of inits? That's his question, and maybe I can just piggyback onto it. It's like in your plot, it seemed like the initialization was slightly different. So,
sorry, here we go. Yeah, so the initialization is slightly different, and in fact, they do have different preferences for initial conditions. So I mean, it's well known that backprop as well is not immune to random initializations. There are certain initializations which work a lot better than others. That's also true of BTSP. And BTSP, the preferred initializations seem to be with lower initial starting weights. So we've tried to find here some reasonable compromise with their relatively close initializations, but still each slightly optimized towards the preferred optimization for the given learning rule. Now they do converge, like the weights distributions are quite different, but yeah, we still need to kind of explore more what the possible solutions are across a much wider range of initializations. But actually, one thing that I could point out here is that because in the nature of this learning rule, if I just pull this up, is that actually postsynaptic activity is in fact not required at all, and you could in principle have a network learn with zero initial weights, zero initial activities, and have just the plateau potentials driving the plasticity. So that's something that obviously would not work at all in backprop, because if you have zero initial weights, you have zero gradients, and the network wouldn't learn. So there are kind of some fundamental differences in how kind of initial conditions affect the network performance, and so yeah. So I think they would be quite different consistently. Yeah.
Okay. Another question by Michele Nardin is the lack of catastrophic, actually two questions. So first question is the lack of catastrophic forgetting due to the sparsity of the weight matrices? And the second question, if you started from the same initial conditions, would BTSP and backprop converge to the same local minima? I guess that one you already answered now. So only the first question, is the lack of catastrophic forgetting due to the sparsity of the weight matrices?
Yeah, so that is something that we're still basically looking into. We suspect that it is, that effectively it converges on solutions that tend to have kind of relies on a smaller subset of weights, so have kind of few strong weights as opposed to many broadly distributed weights that take on many different values. And so that's our suspicion that this is what's kind of underlying the fact that when you introduce new patterns, you're less likely to get overlap between these representations because you're relying on a smaller subset of weights. But yeah, we need to kind of validate that a little further. But certainly the solutions do seem to be quite different in terms of the final minima. Mm-hmm.
Right. So then there's another question which is kind of perhaps important. So that's Jamie Knight asking, is there a paper? The Crowdcast talking heads always covered up your references.
Yeah, well, the paper is coming, but yeah, we haven't published this yet. But that's
all right.
We're working on it.
But so, if there are any references you want to show, then you could move your slides right now, and then they could see. But if the paper is coming, then maybe they're not so crucial. The ones you
So the paper for this specifically is still coming, but yeah, we can have just the references for the experimental stuff that are, like, for example, here the experiments that these principles are based on.
Right. Very well, thanks. So then another question is, how does BTSP perform on more complex tasks? So how does it scale, or what's its scalability compared to backprop and STDP and other?
Yeah. I mean, so we are working on trying to get this to work on like an MNIST task, for example, that is sort of maybe one level up in terms of the complexity of the task. And so now we figured, we wanted to verify that you can actually learn and propagate errors, in a network that's so simple that we can easily interpret exactly what's going on we can really visualize the weight matrices and see what's happening, and already basically have a sense for what a good solution would even look like, which is, we can sort of handcraft what one example of an optimal solution could look like, and that's something that is a little trickier to do with a more complex task. So now that we've kind of have this validation, we can try to scale up. So hopefully it'll work on scaling up to larger tasks, but that's something we're still working on.
Right. So that would then probably also entail adding layers, in a sense. That's probably one question you want to look at.
Yeah, you could. I mean, usually, at least with MNIST tests, the networks you can still get good MNIST performance on networks with only one or two hidden layers. So you don't need to massively scale up the complexity of the architecture in order to get to do that. Yeah.
So I have a question maybe you can bring up the slide in the very beginning again, where you show the architecture of your neurons.
Sure.
And I was wondering whether you could relate it and maybe point us towards a little bit these commonalities and also the differences of this algorithm or this learning rule with regard to the work by Sacramento and Walter Zen that you're perhaps familiar with.
Yeah, sure.
Because I have a similar figure, but it's different.
Right. So, yeah. So I think it's somewhat similar to the Sacramento work in that we do that the dendrites these plateau potentials in the dendrites, they are connected to the soma, so they are going to bump up the activity of the level of the soma. Now, one kind of difference is that we're not doing the spike multiplexing that's like for example, the burst prop papers are doing. So where there's like an actual kind of segregated signal for bursts and regular activity, and which in theory is based on this notion of like short-term facilitation and depression at the level of like synaptic terminals. So we're not doing that. We're directly propagating actual activity, and the difference is that, you know, here in the hidden layer, the computation happens in the dendrite thanks to the interneuron, which is basically trying to effectively predict the baseline activity that's coming from the top down. And then so it has a flavor of predictive coding, where it's trying to predict and cancel out whatever is coming from the next layer and make a sort of a local prediction of what it expects the feedback to be, cancel that out. And then, so when you get this target information coming through, that's an unexpected increase in activity, and that passes through this filter and so drives these excessive plateaus. So there are kind of, some differences in that respect. And then, of course, the weight update itself is different. And for example, the fact that it's weight dependent, and so on. And actually, kind of one thing maybe I can point out here is that sort of one way that we envision also the gradient information going, or the kind of the loss information that's trickling through these plateau potentials, that could be, how do you steer it to go in either positive or negative direction? And kind of one way we envision that is by thinking about like the timing, and the fact that you can steer a synapse towards potentiation or depression by altering the timing of the plateau potential. So if you delay the plateau potential, you know, if we imagine like a spiking implementation, you could delay the plateau potential, and that would tell the synapse, oh, you have to depress rather than potentiate. And so that's how you can get kind of a more modular loss information going through the plateau potential in combination with the presynaptic rate.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. So thanks a lot for this beautiful talk. Thanks for the questions. Unfortunately, I think I missed one, but please reach out to the speaker to ask the question. So we're at the end of session 2. So it's really been a fun day. Thanks to all of the speakers of session 2. And so we have now, again, a half-an-hour break, and then the poster session starts. Just a quick reminder, sign up for the Eventbrite so you get the emails with the link. The link is also here on the side right now in the chat. So Dan just posted it there as Worldwide Neuro. So in half an hour, you can go there with Zoom. You need Zoom to connect, and there will be breakout rooms for each poster. The poster program is on the SNUFA website. So it's snufa.net/2022. And you will find a list of all abstracts there. And then according to the last names, you can choose the breakout rooms and basically run the posters. I hope you enjoy it. And I hope I'll see you there. Thanks again for this beautiful talk. And thanks for a great first day to all the speakers today.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.